Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I'm going to be reviewing two books by the same author, and these are Vicious by V.E. Schwab and The Invisible Life of Addy Larue by V.E. Schwab. Just a heads up, this is going to be a lightly spoilery discussion video. Like, it is ostensibly a review, but it's really much more of an assessment of like my own thoughts on V.E. Schwab as someone who is new to her books. I'm not going to give away like huge plot things, but I will be talking about like, some key details in these stories. Also, in this video, I'm going to be talking about some scenes that like have to do with consent and like sort of like rapey stuff in the books, so just keep that in mind. So V.E. Schwab is one of those authors that I have heard plenty about, but like up until about a month or so ago, I had never actually read her. But because she's an immensely successful author who's also written books that people seem to have pretty strong opinions about, I have kind of felt like I've read her books. One of the things that was really striking to me before having read V.E. Schwab at all is the fact that like she's probably one of the more polarizing authors I've heard about, but like she's polarizing in a really unique way. Like, some authors are polarizing because all of their books are annoying to people, or like, they might be someone who wrote like a really, really great book and then followed it up with a book that did not do as well. So like, there's kind of like a split sort of thing happening there. But like V.E. Schwab is like polarizing down to like specific combinations of books. Like there are some people who will like one series but hate the other, and then the people who are like in the opposite group. Like she is very polarizing, like along different axes of taste. And so from the outside, it's very much one of those things where you're like, well, which one is it? Like, which books do I read? Which ones do I not read? Like, are they good? Are they bad? I have no idea. Like, I don't, like, having not read her books, it's like very weird and confusing what that means in terms of like whether or not I should read them. And for the most part, like, it's weird and confusing, but it's also fine. Like I was perfectly fine standing on the sidelines and watching people go through this round with every release of like, is this one good? Is this one bad? Like, no, I liked that one, but I hate this one, or I love this one, but I hate that one. Like, I'm fine with just watching that play out. Except the latest release that she had, The Invisible Life of Addy Larue, had me really intrigued. In this book, a 17th century French girl, she makes this pact with an old god that basically leaves her immortal and like also completely unattached from the world. Like she can live in it, but she won't be remembered. She can't like say her name. She can't own property. Like people just promptly forget her. So to create some sense of like a memory of her, to create some sense of something, almost like out of spite, well, definitely out of spite for this deal that she made, but also just like, for her own sake, she finds ways to insert herself into art to kind of create a lasting memory of her. And she's lived like this for 300 years until like 2014 in New York City. She meets this one guy named Henry, and he apparently remembers her. So that premise, it had me curious. So did people's reactions to the book. There were people who were very, very much like, I love this book, and then people who were very, very much like, nope, don't like it. So even though I wanted to read the book, I knew because it was a new release, I was gonna have to wait for it for a while from the library. So I decided, in the meantime, why don't I check out the one other V.E. Schwab book I've heard about that I've been really curious about, which is Vicious, which is part one of her two-book series. I think it's called the Villains series, which is about these two former friends who in college, they like work together on this experimental thing to develop superpowers. And of course the experiment goes awfully, as experiments tend to do. And that leads to them having to basically fight each other. Surprisingly, because my library is fucking amazing, I actually got Invisible Life very shortly after Vicious. So I figured, you know what, I was able to read these books pretty much back to back. Why don't I just sit down and review them together and see like how they kind of stack up against these things that I've heard about V.E. Schwab, and kind of like what they make me feel about like, I don't know, the way books can be polarizing, and like what makes a good, interesting, polarizing book versus one that's polarizing for what I think are kind of less exciting reasons. Again, this is going to be a slightly spoilery discussion, but also I have not read the second book in the Villains series, so some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are probably not going to be completely complete in some regards. And so if there are things that I am talking about with regards to Vicious that you think are maybe resolved or kind of work in a different way when you take the series like into consideration as a whole, feel free to spoil me down below. I do want to read the second book at some point, but like I'm not feeling a super huge amount of urgency, so I'm pretty welcome to being spoiled for like stuff that happens, if you think it's related to this discussion overall. So again, I read Vicious first, then about a month later, I started reading The Invisible Life of Addy Larue. And one of the things that became pretty clear about like 100 or so pages into Invisible Life, maybe even sooner than that, is that there were a lot of very, very similar elements between these books. For one, they both really fuck around with time. They jump around from like the present day to the past, going back and forth to establish these links between different events, between different character traits, to different plot points across time. And on like a bare bones character level, maybe more like a magic level, there is also a very similar fixation on like two particular forms of superpowers in these books. In Vicious, we've got Victor and his regenerative abilities, which has a lot in common with Addy LaRue's immortality. And then also in Vicious, you've got Serena and her ability to basically make people do whatever she wants them to do. And then in Invisible Life, you have Henry, who has sort of this like cosmic kind of irresistibility, which in turn then makes everyone around him like want to do whatever it is that whatever it is that will please him, basically. Like they're all in love with him, and to satisfy their love for him, they want to make him happy. Moreover, these superpowers have a similar kind of like crisis, deal with the devil kind of aspect to them. In Invisible Life, you are very much making a deal with the devil. You are literally trading your soul in exchange for a wish that manifests in some kind of abilities. And in Vicious, you may not be signing a contract with the devil, but the basis for the kind of extraordinary abilities that end up happening to these characters are all rooted in like their like surviving a near-death encounter. It's like almost like a reflection of how they like want to survive. In both books then, like whatever ability you get is like a reflection of your own personality. In Vicious, it's a passive reflection of who the character is and how they seek survival. And in Invisible Life, it's an active choice based on what you want of the world and the wish you're making of it. But the core of it is still the same. In the world of these books and the way that Schwab conceives of magic or abilities or whatever you want to call it, like operating them, your abilities are an extension of some kind of inner want. And so then the rest of the story is basically a classic be careful what you wish for. And so when I started Invisible Life and I started noticing all of these like very specific parallels, there was a part of me that was kind of skeptical. But now having finished both of these books, what's interesting to me is that, you know, they have all of these same elements and clearly are written by the same author, but the books feel very, very different from one another. It's vicious, and Invisible Life, in contrast, is much more like a journey, almost like it almost feels like a memoir. And that even goes down to like the stylistic similarities that actually manifest really differently in these books. Starting with the time jumps, they are employed to very different effect in both of these books. When I read Vicious, one of the things that stood out to me about the time jumps is how they fit in with this feeling of like a comic book that's essentially being told in novel format. Like every jump in time felt very much like an individual comic book issue. Like the way that like, you know, comic book issues feel like a very, very like segmented arc, and each issue feels very, very distinct and separate from each other. That's how each time jump in Vicious felt. And I used to read comic books a lot more frequently, and part of the reason why I stopped is I had a hard time keeping up with individual comics. So usually if I check in with comics now, it's really more with like the collected editions, and reading this book felt a lot like reading one of those collected editions. Like all of these individual time jumps were a comic book that had been strung together into this whole book. In contrast, while time jumps around in Invisible Life, it feels less like jumping and more like swimming. It's more flowing, and in some ways the plotting feels less tight compared to Vicious, which is clearly building between very like distinct events that have happened in these characters' lives. But it's a sort of looseness that suits the kind of untethered journey that Addy LaRue has been on over the course of all of these centuries. You know, this is a character for whom time has essentially lost all meaning because she's had no way to really register herself in it. And that made for a very different reading experience. Vicious was really hard for me to put down. It moved super fast, and like every few pages you were like in a different time with a different set of characters, and like some different major event was happening, and so it was just very fast and consuming to get through. Meanwhile, Invisible Life was more meandering, the stakes were a lot less immediate, and so like it felt a lot slower overall, but in a way that suited what I wanted out of this book. And the way that Schwab works with her characters' like abilities in these books is also very different, in part because your relationship to the protagonist is different. Vicious is part one of a series called Villains. It's not a series about heroes or even necessarily people that you were gonna always be rooting for. And while I was reading it, the main feeling I had was that I was definitely the right audience for this book, because I have watched a truly obscene amount of Real Housewives. Not just watched, rewatched again, 7, 8, 10 times. Like I have watched a lot of Real Housewives. And a key motif of Real Housewives, of the Real Housewives oeuvre, is like the fight where everyone is wrong. Where like everyone is so wrong that even when they are right, they are still wrong. Vicious was Real Housewives but with superpowers, which is frankly a little bit more terrifying. Everyone in this book was awful, like except for maybe like 2 characters. And like even when you're like, you know, like this character has done this thing to that character and that's why they are mad and are doing a thing to the other character who did the bad thing to them, like you know that you are technically on the same side of this person in one regards. Even then they will do something where you're just like, nope, I can't be on your side. I can't root for you either. You're just like, you know, you're right, but you're still so wrong. Like that is the feeling throughout the entirety of this book. And I feel pretty comfortable assuming that Schwab is not really intending for any of us to be looking up to these characters or to necessarily wanting to be their friends. I don't think she's like particularly concerned with likability in any of these characters. I think she's just very interested in what happens when like young selfish geniuses get superpowers and other people get caught up in their like megalomaniac, self-interested, self-obsessed wake. And I, for one, applaud her commitment to that, because to pull that off, to like be able to write a compelling story around characters who I personally am not rooting for in any way, shape, or form, that is what you need, is commitment. If you're gonna let your characters be like 70 to 90% morally bankrupt, like you gotta let them be 70 to 90% morally bankrupt. Like you can't be too concerned with making them likable. You gotta like go all the way with that. Again, I am basing this just on having read Vicious, and I think part of the reason why I'm a little bit nervous about reading the second book is because I'm worried that there will be some kind of like wheeling back on that, like some kind of backing away from just how awful these characters are. So I might be a little bit limited in how I'm like approaching that discussion, but at least for this one book, I very much respect the fact that it goes all in with how terrible they are. Invisible Life is similarly committed to its characters, but it is pretty different from Vicious. For one, like Addy and Henry, they are both flawed characters, but like neither of them are like fucking assholes who are bent on like whatever murderous bullshit the people in Vicious are intent on. Like if Vicious is Real Housewives, Invisible Life is season 8 of Are You the One? It's sexually fluid, everyone's a little bit messy, but it's also very empathetic and endearing. Like one of my major complaints for a lot of Invisible Life was just kind of like how like meh the romance was between Addy Larue and Henry, especially because it was like so clearly born out of the fact that they were just like happy to have found like the one person who like is not affected by their powers, which is sweet, but like I feel like finding someone who is a loophole for like your own be careful what you wish for lesson, like, you know, that's great and all, but it doesn't necessarily make you compatible. Addy actually does end up acknowledging this towards the end of the book, and it's a moment that really stuck with me because I think for me what it really did was wrap up her character and her arc in a way that like made it all stick so much more clearly in my own mind, and like made me understand more of what her character like was over this whole 300-year span. It might sound like the opposite of commitment to have your main character basically walk back the whole romantic arc that's taken place over the course of your book, but I loved it because it felt really true to the characters and like everything that they had been going through and everything that we had learned about them. And it felt really true to like what the story felt like it had actually been telling me. I'm so used to reading kind of tepid, disappointing, low chemistry romances in books that it was actually kind of nice to have a book be like, yeah, that's actually kind of the point here. And yet at the same time, it didn't actually undermine the romance that was in the story. It just cast it in a different light from like your standard star-crossed lover story. It gave a different meaning to it in Addy's story and in everything else going on. I started my discussion by talking about how these books have like all of these similar elements, but kind of like apply them differently. But interestingly, my biggest frustration with both Invisible Life and Vicious are rooted in the same issue, which is to me a very shallow willingness to deal with like the full implications and issues around Serena and Henry's powers. In Vicious, Serena's power is basically like she tells you to do something and you do it. And that is a pretty rapey power to have, and it becomes actual rape in the books when she uses it to coerce another character into sex, which is not sex, it's rape. The book is pretty clear overall that her powers are a gross violation of other people's like free will, of their consent. Like it is clear that her powers are not good and that she is using them in a way that is not good. Again, this is vicious. Like, we are not aspiring to be any of these characters, I hope. But the book also has like a lot of different conversations going around like the ethics of different elements of different people's powers and personalities, and just like killing and stuff like that. And like, so, like there's a lot of thinking going on around all of these different like ethical questions in the book. And in contrast, to me, it felt weirdly mute about just how rapey her powers are, and like really in particular how rapey this scene is. And this was a scene that did not really add to my understanding of the characters. It did not add to my understanding of the plot. So having it come in and then feel so unexamined both during and afterwards just felt really off to me, especially because we have like multiple scenes where just like thinking about her power broadly, but also in her relationship with this one character who she rapes. Like a thing that Serena is always preoccupied with is like this desire to have someone fight back, like her wish that someone could like refuse her. And like that for me, like it's a very difficult thing to like go down that path with your character without dealing, in my opinion, with the full ramifications of what has happened in that other scene. Henry's power in Invisible Life is not quite the same. It's a little bit different. It just like manifests similarly. Like again, the whole world is in love with him, so they are basically constantly trying to please him. They're trying to get him to love them back. And as his friend B points out, like not necessarily knowing fully what's going on, there's no choice in that. Like people are not being able to consent to being in love with this person. And that becomes like especially uncomfortable to me to read, given like the number of times we read about him having sex with other characters who are, you know, essentially acting under a cosmic date rape drug. But like Serena, Henry's fixation becomes on what his power is taken away from him, which is any sense of honesty or meaningful interaction with the other people around him, and like the feeling that they are giving him their like real authentic self. And I think it's like fair to examine that, especially because a lot of Henry's arc is related to like his own lack of ambition, his own lack of self, and like how much of himself is rooted in like wanting other people to approve of him, and how that's driven all of this self-loathing. So there's a lot to unpack there about like how our sense of love is built on understanding that other people have a choice in that love, and also like how no amount of love from other people can, you know, overcome your own need to deal with your own self-loathing. And so there are a lot of very affecting scenes in this book where Henry has to contend with the parts of himself that like wanted this, that thought that this was going to make him happy, and also to understand why it was always going to fail, why it was always going to fall short. But again, the book feels really skittish around discussing like, you know, just how fraught any scene of him having sex is. Like it knows it, Henry's bummed about it, but like fade to black and move on. To be very blunt and maybe to be a little bit black and white about it, just because that's what it is to me, I think it's just always going to make me really uncomfortable to read any kind of sex scene in this context, on page or off. And it's really going to make it difficult for me to sympathize with the mind controlling or mind affecting character in question. I don't know what a satisfying way of handling these stories would have looked like, but I know that neither Vicious nor Invisible Life had it for me. And like, I don't think Schwab's trying to like present these scenes in any kind of romantic light. I think they're supposed to be uncomfortable. But I also think this very specific thing that both Serena and Henry can do leaves these issues very much open to interpretation and up to the reader, and like just very much subject to how they're going to take it in and interpret them. And for me, and for how I read these scenes, it's something that I wish was more considered in both of these books. And next to how thought out everything else felt, the comparative lack of examination with this like one major thing in both books felt narratively underwhelming and just icky. So, okay, so that was like my overall sense of the books, but like, what did I think of reading V.E. Schwab for the first time? Well, one of the things I will say is I definitely get like why her books are so polarizing. I said earlier that I really liked how committed Vicious was to these awful characters, and as you can maybe tell, like committed is a word that I would use to describe her writing a lot. Her approach to plotting feels very committed to the story being told. Her approach to characters feels very committed to both like the fictional individuals and the world she's building around them. And her approach to her writing style, again, yes, it feels very committed. And I just really enjoyed reading that. I felt like most of the time when I was reading these books, it felt like they had a really clear point of view going into them. And so reading them was fun in part because it kind of felt like she was having fun writing them. Especially when the books start to go like haywire and everything like changes, like the writing structure changes, like all of this stuff. Like, you know, it all felt like a lot of fun, even if like it's also at times like a little bit like heartbreaking. And of course, the thing about committing is that you run the risk of alienating your readers, especially like if they are people who maybe like one thing in one of your books and then you go off like in a slightly different direction in another book. Again, Vicious and Invisible Life, they have so many similar elements, but they also feel very different. And I could see someone loving one of these books and absolutely hating the other. And I could also totally buy that I just got lucky and picked up like two books that had like a lot of similar elements and that also just happened to have the sort of story and the sort of writing style that I really enjoy. And then I could pick up another V.E. Schwab book that maybe even has these same elements and I would hate it. Like, I could totally buy all of that happening. And honestly, I kind of respect that. And that doesn't mean that I like everything about these books, but often the things that I didn't like about Vicious and Invisible Life were the things that felt like they stopped short of just how like ambitious or thought out everything else felt. Like the stuff that was less examined. And so there's the rapey stuff I talked about, but there's also like, you know, the inevitable fridging of female characters in Vicious. And then on the other end, the flip side, you've got this like seemingly inexplicable charm of Addy Larue, whose like main defining characteristics seem to be freckles and freedom. And all of those things are frustrating, and they're frustrating because they make the books less surprising. For all of the choices that feel so deliberately and ambitiously thought out in these books, those other choices feel so in line with like standard annoying tropes in fiction without bringing anything new. And they just drag down the rest of the ambition of the book. But just because it's a frustrated ambition, it's still there for me. I love authors who I can reliably turn to like dependently give me like exactly what I want out of a book. But I also just really like the idea of authors who are just kind of like, you know, I'm gonna fuck around a bit, see what happens. When it comes to the online book community, I think V.E. Schwab is one of the more polarizing authors I've heard of. I don't know if that's quantifiably true, but that was just like my sense going into these books. Of course, she's not the only polarizing author, and her books are not the only polarizing books, but like my previous experience with polarizing books in this community is that they have often been, in my personal experience, pretty boring and mediocre, like actually to the point where I'm usually like, I don't even know why any of us have such strong opinions about this book. Except in those cases, I too often end up having strong feelings about those books. And it's usually because my feeling about like the mediocrity of the book in question feels like disproportionately important because other people just like don't agree with me. Is it actually important? I mean, to me, yeah, but like in the grand scheme of the book, no. But in the context of these books, because this is my background feeling about like polarizing books in general, I was kind of worried that the same thing was going to happen. I thought I was going to read two books that have like all of these strong opinions around them, and I was going to like dig in and then find out that it's actually like both of these books are pretty just like, you know, whatever. So it's possible that like part of the reason why I'm like net positive on these books is because like they have exceeded a very minimal set of expectations, which is that I was not bored. But it's not just that I wasn't bored with the one book. It was like I moved on to the next book, saw a lot of the same ideas and like character types and whatever being teased out, but like I still wasn't bored. And for me, that was like more than just like not boring. It was actually kind of thrilling because it could have gone really, really wrong. So often our discussions of books just boil down to like, do you think this book is good or bad? And I think that's understandable given the nature of BookTube, given the nature of book reviews, like, you know, that we're all trying to help each other just like figure out what we're gonna read and also just like talk about the things that we read and whether or not we like them. But writing is so much more than like whether any individual reader likes or doesn't like a given book. I don't have to like every V.E. Schwab book, and based on what other people say, I don't really expect to. And if that means that I get books with a similar sort of approach to writing, but like in very different ambitious ways, then honestly, I kind of love that. So thank you guys for watching. If you've read Vicious or Invisible Life, if you want to talk about them down below, go do that, and yeah, bye.